to put the reins of history back in the hands of man, a phrase that defines the overall plot of Final Fantasy XII, as well as the catalyst of the actions of one of Final Fantasy's most sinister and manipulative villains, and is one of my favorite characters overall. In a game that is often overlooked, Final Fantasy XII's politically driven story is a turnoff for many fans, considering the previous Final Fantasy entries have been more on the emphasis on the fantasy genre, and not so much on the relationship between kingdoms, rulers, and the conflict that comes in between. Those elements provide the most complex story that can be great if well executed, which Final Fantasy XII does not do the best job of doing, at least from a direct perspective. However, after doing some research, I have acquired a better understanding of the story that I will start covering lore from Final Fantasy XII as the second Final Fantasy game coming to the channel, so be sure to subscribe if you wish to see related content. Perhaps one of the more manipulative and sinister characters in the series, Vayne Solidor is a villain who is adept at using his environment to his advantage to meet his desired goals. Upon closer look at the events of Final Fantasy XII, it is clear that Vayne instigates many of the events that reshape the government of Arcades and Dalmasca in a way that puts him in a position of power. This may not be clear at the first playthrough, but Vayne's work behind the scenes is very subtle, yet very effective at shaping the plot of the game and the overall journey of the party. This very subtle detail about Vayne Solidor makes him one of my favorite villains. Despite his lack of strength and might, his military IQ, charisma, and manipulation skills more than make up for his lack of direct interaction with the party during the game. So in today's episode of Final Fantasy Lore, we will be taking a look at Final Fantasy XII's main antagonist, Vayne Solidor. Vayne was born 27 years before the events of Final Fantasy XII, as the third of Emperor Gramis's 4 sons. Out of all his children, his ambition is prominently shown through Vayne, who has followed in his father's footsteps and has created goals for himself, ones that we see later on in the game. We learn that on his father's orders, Vayne had murdered his 2 older brothers out of the Emperor's fear of an uprising. With this action, Vayne had become the next in line to the throne of Arcadia, and consequently reducing House Solidor to Gramis, himself, and his younger brother Larsa, for whom he holds a soft spot. At some point before the event of the game, Vayne comes across the ambitious researcher Dr. Cid and his newly acquired ally Vayne, whom Vayne shares the idea of placing history back in the hands of man. It is not confirmed, but perhaps through the duo that Vayne's pursuit of glory and the desire to be the new Dynast king becomes his ultimate goal. Thus, he allows Draclor Laboratory to be used unhindered by Dr. Cid to research on the creation of manufactured nethicite, the artificial equivalent of the nethicite that would be created by the Ocuria for the Dynast king. This would provide the means to become the Dynast king without being labeled as the puppet of the Ocuria. However, in order for Cid to continue his research, he required 2 pieces of deified nethicite, the Dusk Shard and the Midlight Shard, which are held at Nabradia and Dalmasca respectively. In order to achieve this, the Empire launched an attack on Nabradia using the pretext of the uprising of the Neo-Rosarian faction in the city, a faction whose goal is to unite the kingdoms of Nabradia and Rosaria by stopping the marriage between the Prince Rassler and their Lady Ashe. As Nabradia is an ally of Dalmasca through his marriage, the latter is forced to counterattack. The Dalmascan forces, led by King Raminas, Prince Rassler, Captain Vosh von Ronsenberg, and Captain Vossler Azelis, the 2 armies clash in Albina Fortress. However, the overwhelming numbers of the Imperial army results in a Dalmascan retreat, with Rassler succumbing to his wounds suffered by an arrow from an Imperial archer. With the Imperial victory over Nabradia, Dr. Cid had acquired the Midlight Shard and had requested Judge Zet to test its power. To Zet's fear, the shard had wiped out the entirety of the capital of Nabudis and its people, a feat that had caused the judge to discard his name and title, to retreat to the port city of Balfonheim, where he will be known as Redis as we know in the game. With the defeat of Dalmasca, the Empire had given them conditions to allow for a peaceful surrender, but Vayne had other ideas. In a plan orchestrated by himself and Gabranth, they plotted to kill King Raminas and place the blame on Gabranth's twin brother Bosch for the act of treason, a plan which was executed perfectly, resulting in the full unconditional surrender of Dalmasca, thus placing it under Imperial control and Bosch being incarcerated for treason, all of which was witnessed by a fallen Rex, who died believing his captain had betrayed the country he sworn to protect. In addition to his manipulative side, we see a more charismatic front with Vayne in the earlier part of Final Fantasy XII. Now appointed the new consul of Rabanastre, he is challenged with winning the adoration of its people. He does so by honoring King Raminas and claiming that the late ruler of Dalmasca would have wanted them to push for peace and that he lives through them, a speech that is widely praised and accepted by the population of Rabanastre, barring that of Vaughn and Penelo. Another sample of Vayne's intelligence is showcased shortly afterwards, as he lures the resistance by declaring a fete to be held at the palace of Rabanastre, only for the resistance to meet an army of Imperial soldiers and ultimately results in the arrest of Lady Ashe and the party. In an interesting interaction found in the manga version of the game, Vaughn confronts Vayne during the skirmish. Vaughn, enraged by death of his brother at the hands of the Empire, strikes at Vayne, only for Gabranth to block his attack and for Vayne to order for Vaughn to be executed for attacking an Arcadian official, in which Vaughn is saved by Balthier and Fran. Vayne ultimately gains possession of the 3 shards when the Empire captures Ashe shortly upon acquiring the Dawn Shard in the Tomb of Wraithwall and the Dusk Shard from Vaughn, thus giving Dr. Sid the resources he needs to create the manufactured nethicite in which Vayne could use to rule as the new Dynast King. Despite Vayne's victory over the conquered kingdoms and his goals being achieved, trouble resided back home in Arcades, as the Imperial Senate's fear of Vayne's growing power results in them endorsing the much younger Larsa to become Arcades' next emperor. We know of this revelation through Vayne's conversations with Sid, Gabranth, and later his father, who is revealed to be on the verge of death. Vayne's idea of necessity blanketing his ruthless actions causes his father to worry about him and the depths he will go to in order to achieve his goals. Seeing his father's weakness in the Imperial Senate preventing him of taking the Arcadian throne, Vayne uses his skills at manipulation to plot the murder of his father and frame the chairman Gregoroth in order to strip the powers of authority from the Senate and assign them to himself, using the front of the Senate falling into disarray after the seemingly act of treason by its own chairman. With this plot, Vayne now assumes control of all of Arcades. This is further supported by the Judge Magisters due to the rising power of Rosaria and fear of its eventual invasion. They believe the ruler must have a firm hand and not be hindered by other parties, especially in the face of war. One of the judges sees through his lies, but by this point, Vayne had acquired so much power that he orders Drace to be executed and to be done so by the hands of Gabranth, with whom Vayne grows distasteful of for spying on him and reporting his work to the late Emperor Gramis. In addition, Vayne orders Larsa to remain by his side for the remainder of the story in order to keep an eye on him and prevent any further obstacles to his plan. Despite Larsa's attempt to push diplomatic means to make peace with Dalmasca, Vayne affirms that a show of strength will put the people in line and believes that
today we write the first page of a new history. Our history. Each of you must play his part. Put down this rebellion.
With the pieces falling in place, Vayne has now become the leader of the Arcadian Empire and all the obstacles are dealt with. Well, except for one. The rising power of the resistance backed by Rosarian support led by Marquis Ondor of Bujerba is ready to wage war with Arcades. But Vayne unveils a new weapon. Using the power emitted by the recently destroyed Suncrest, the Sky Fortress Bahamut, a very powerful airship that is run with the use of glossair rings, emerges in the skies above Rabanastre and enters the battle against the resistance. We witness its power when its super cannon perched at the top of the airship destroys an entire armada from the resistance. As the battle between the resistance and the Empire wage on, the party infiltrate the Sky Fortress for one last confrontation with Vayne. In one last attempt, Vayne shows Larsa the meaning of power and why it is required to rule a kingdom, but a defiant Larsa turns on his brother and sides with the party, later being joined by Gabranth once Vayne harnesses the power of Vena to transform into Vayne Novus. Despite his transformations into Novus and the Undying, Vayne is ultimately defeated by the party and himself and Vena perish in battle. However, we see that Vena and Vayne offer comfort for one another as they achieve their ultimate goal of releasing control of history from the hands of Acuria due to the destruction of the Suncrest, but Vayne's quest of becoming the Dynast King results in his own downfall. Vayne Solidor's actions directly impact the overall plot of the story as his work behind the scenes gave way to put himself in a position of power in Arcades while disposing of anyone that barred his path. His ruthlessness and ambition knows no bounds as he will do anything to get what he desires, while avoiding to be perceived as a malicious and aggressive leader in the process, with the ultimate goal of becoming the Dynast King using manufactured nethicite researched and developed by Sid and Draklor with the help of Vena. While he never achieves his end goal, Vayne still causes a lot of chaos, havoc, and war in Ivalice. And thus ends the tale of Vayne Carudas Solidor. What did you think of him? Did you enjoy his implementation in the story of Final Fantasy XII? Furthermore, did you like the way he presented himself and how he used his qualities and his environment to achieve his goals? Or perhaps would you have preferred a villain without these qualities and used more direct and confrontational means to reach them? Let me know in the comment section below and what other characters or events you would like me to cover next. Also, if you enjoy, please consider leaving a like on the video and subscribe if you wish to see more Final Fantasy content. Other than that, this is Enzo signing out, and I will see you again soon.